A reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, and chapter 21, 1 through 7. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready 3 measures of choice flour, knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate.
They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, "God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age."
God bless the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. Amen.
Amen.
So, my name is Reverend Mark Koyama. I'm the minister at the United Church of Jaffrey. And you are?
I am the Reverend Joel Eaton, the newest of the chaplains here at Havenwood Heritage Heights. I say here, where I am. And Mark and I are friends from before pre-ordination. We both met at Yale Divinity School, where we studied together and played music together. And Mark let me sleep on his couch when I was needing a place to stay.
That's right. do we have the honor of both having played music at each other's ordinations? I think that's right, haven't we? And we both at each other's ordinations, if I'm not mistaken.
You preached the homily at mine.
That's right. Well, we have quite an interesting passage here, don't we, Joel? This is the This has always been one of my favorites. And one of the first things that I noticed, for those of you at HHH who don't know me, and as well as being a minister, I'm also an English teacher. So perhaps you may pick up on that a little bit with this comment, and that is that, like, there's a very kind of novelistic quality to the opening of this passage.
Mm.
It almost feels like, well, it's either novelistic or it's cinematographic. It's like it's almost like you're kind of zooming in on Abraham from a high vantage, and you're kind of you. It's very specific. You're like, he's sitting there, at the entrance of his tent, by the oaks of Mamre, and I just
Yeah.
such a beautiful phrase. I almost want to name my kid Oaks of Mamre or something. Such a beautiful phrase,
Yeah.
And he's sitting there in the shade of the entrance of his tent, so you can tell it's a really hot day.
Mm.
And that this place where the oaks are, is perhaps, just this one place where you get a little bit of respite from the heat. So, like, just right in the very, very first sentence, you get this very evocative moment
Mm.
in the Bible. I think it's a lovely moment.
Yeah, it's a little oasis.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it's there that this wonder-filled encounter happens in this place of refreshment, this place of cool, of relief.
Yeah, of shade.
In the midst of a otherwise exhausting, kind of enervating atmosphere.
Yeah. And then there's this really confusing thing that happens, which is that there are these three people who show up, and yet if I'm not mistaken, Abraham refers to them as my Lord, which is singular, right? So you have right away, you have this kind of confusing situation where you have three people, but they're referred to in the singular. What's that all about?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what exegetically, what does it mean? And in the text itself, it's been made so many things,
Right.
in subsequent art. And I think you think of Anton Rublev's icon for the Trinity,
Yeah.
this picture of the three visitors around a table, sharing what in the icon is clearly communion.
Mm-hmm.
And this picture then is evoking the person of God as one who is in communion, whose very being is communion. And that beloved kind of hospitality in that space is the space of God out of which we and everything has come. I mean, I think there's a beautiful image of God in this passage, but I join you in that curiosity. Like, what's going on in this passage? It's been made much of, but it's very peculiar that three become the singular my Lord.
The confusion itself, I think, is worth sitting in, for a while, because just like you said, God appears in communion, in relationship, right?
Yeah.
And you need more than one in order to create relationship.
Right.
The tendency is to try and kind of resolve the difficulty as quickly as possible. But it may be that the kind of more spiritual reading is the reading which allows that confusion to to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the idea that you had just now, which is that, like, that the reason it's confusing is because God is not singular. God must be plural in order to express relationship.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. This very beginning. I mean, if you think about the story of Abraham, you have that Genesis 12 moment where he hears the call to go from your country, from your family, and go to a place where I will show you. And this is complete, like, uh, going out and into the unknown and the uncertain. And here you have, in some ways, kind of a bookend of that, or at least a milestone in that particular narrative, where Abraham is hearing a kind of encouraging reminder that this thing that he left everything for and went into the unknown for, uh, we haven't forgotten about that.
Right.
But he also has a much more tangible encounter with the divine in this story, and I think it is incredibly significant that the image of that encounter is the community, the threeness, the more than oneness at the very least.
Right.
And this, I love that, in the oasis, and where there is a space of meeting that evokes hospitality and staying for a while.
And relief, right? Relief.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting moment that I picked up on this time when we read it together, which I think maybe the first time I picked up on it, is that, like, if you imagine these three people kind of wandering in from the desert, right, into this oasis, and he says, stay a while and have some water, but he doesn't say have some water to drink. He says have some water to wash your feet with, which really, it's like you'd think, like, if these guys are just wandering in from the desert, they're gonna want that water to drink, not to wash their feet with. And it's almost like there's, like, it never occurred to me before this moment that, like, in a way, it's almost an expression of extravagance, where it's like, look, we have so much water here that you can not only drink it, but you can also wash your feet with it. And just imagine how tired, and how sore their dogs were when they wandered in from the desert, and how much they probably wanted not only to have a drink of cool water, but also to wash their feet.
Yeah.
It's almost like that extravagant welcome, the kind of the UCC thing with the extravagant welcome. It's like, not only do you get to drink water, but you also get to wash your feet. Oh, and I wonder do you think that is has any resonance with the Last Supper?
That is the first time I've ever connected. I mean, besides the Rublev painting, these two moments. There's foot washing and communion here, and there's foot washing and communion in the upper room. And both, in many ways, are these beginnings where there's a promise given towards a future and a hope.
Right.
Well, and it's worth thinking about too, like, what those images are in both places. If you think about Abraham Abraham is the central figure of three of the world's largest religions. And Abraham is just immediately, if you were to do like an associations test, the word faith comes with Abraham, and I think he's called the father of faith, etc. And faith is fundamentally connected to this posture of hospitality, this openness, this extravagant welcome, like you're describing. Sees these strangers and and without really batting an eye, I mean, we could go into the details. We don't know all the details, but he brings these strangers into his respite space,
Mm-hmm.
maybe interrupting his own like time of contemplation and meditation or whatever.
Right.
And he brings them in and just opens his heart and think about what Jesus is communicating in that upper room with the foot washing is this, again, an extravagant opening of ourselves for one another, to one another, and with a vision of that this faith is what will open up the world.
Right. So there's almost there's so the way you're talking, there's a direct correlation between the whole notion of hospitality and the whole notion of faith.
Yeah.
That hospitality in some ways makes hospitality, in a sense, is like built into the notion of hospitality, is this kind of vulnerability that you have to make yourself vulnerable in order to open your safe space to a stranger, right?
Right. And we're also living in this time where we are wearing masks, right? A lot of people there's this added kind of worry about relating to people that we aren't intimate with.
Mm.
And I'm walking down the road and very aware and cognizant of all these things, and my son is calling out from across the street, "Hi, what are you doing? Where are you going?" and it's beautiful because even if we had masks on, I could still say those kinds of things. What is causing me to have this knee-jerk reservation disconnection from the stranger? It's so learned.
Yeah.
It's and there's something that's something that challenges that and definitely stretches me, because then I have to interact usually with some sort of like smile and like
Right.
my head and right. Isn't that cute and adorable that he's asking these questions and you're answering them very nicely?
Yeah.
So, but there's something about that hospitality, the encounter of humans or persons, let's say, to one another, that is, when it does happen, and when children open that up, like John Henry does, there is something beautiful that happens in that event.
Absolutely, without
it wouldn't have happened if he hadn't done that.
Right.
And I feel like there's something of truth, of a greater truthfulness in that way of relating that we've habitually avoided.
Yeah, yeah. And yet this story that we're reading right now, Joel, is a story of presumably like a 99-year-old man. Like, my father was a wandering Aramean. Like he's been around the block, like literally. Like this Abraham is like, he's not a naive young boy. He's the patriarch of patriarchs, right? Like, yeah, in a sense, he's the quintessence of the kind of the wise, experienced old man, and he's and so like even at that point, like being able to respond in this radical kind of like openness to strangers, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it makes me think that in some ways his faith, his age has brought him through whatever that is that
Right.
does kind of hang on me like a crust.
Mm-hmm.
And it's made him fresh and young again,
Yeah.
even in a way that is incorporating and integrating all of his painful experiences, everything that could jade him,
Right.
everything that could cause him to be a island unto himself.
Right. The Buddhist philosophy makes a great deal of this whole notion of kind of childlikeness and like the way that like children kind of respond to the world without preconception, and that kind of freshness of perception is something that's somewhat akin to the notion of enlightenment. Um, and and the and you think about like the way in which like our preconceptions kind of mold our interactions with each other. In a sense, the interaction between Derek Chauvin and George Floyd was kind of the essence of that, of um, that expression of suspicion and distrust and and preconception.
Yeah.
It's what racism is made of.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and it's because, and so you have the contrast here, that kind of the hospitality that we're seeing as an expression of that faith, that kind of exuberant, extravagant welcome, and what has happened to us. And I think in some places in our world, we see this kind of most intensely in someone like Derek Chauvin, that kind of loss of trust, and there's fear in it. There's a desire to control and be in a position of dominance rather than mutuality.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, that's what racism is made of, because racism comes out of this desire to control humans,
Mm-hmm.
and uses fear and distrust, uses this loss of personhood in a way to manipulate how humans can relate and will relate.
It's the language of brutality and dominance, and in a sense, what we see from Abraham is the opposite, right, of that. It's the language of faith, which is the language of like, oh yes, come in and and wash your feet and have something to eat, and in a way it's kind of like this expression of kind of giving the universe the benefit of the doubt, right? Like,
Right.
Like it's entirely possible that those strangers could have totally abused him and stolen all of his things, and but but Abraham approaches the whole experience as one where it's like he has trust in the kind of a fundamental trust in the possibilities there, and perhaps in a sense prejudice and racism is an expression of fundamental distrust.
Yeah, and a kind of cynical despair
Mm.
that there is no future but the future that we make for ourselves by our getting ahead in the present, or by manipulating our relationships with others for our own end.
So before we finish talking, we definitely have to talk about this situation with Sarah, right? And in some ways, like it's relevant to our conversation so far, because if you think about kind of this Abraham being this old man who's been around the block a million times and really knows his deal, but still is yet able to be very extravagant with his welcome. In a sense, you could construe Sarah's laughter as a kind of almost as the opposite reaction, in a way, kind of like, oh, are you kidding me? Kind of like, don't be absurd. Like, this is you're being led by your nose, kind of thing, like somebody's pulling your leg, kind of thing.
Right.
And that's really kind of the response that the strangers have to her.
Yeah.
they're bent out of shape because she's not responding in faith, she's responding in reality.
Mm. Yeah, she's she's having a much more practical response,
Right. Yeah.
but it's not. There's the, yeah, I think it's not this extravagant openness to the idea. I mean, partly perhaps because we're talking about her body.
Yeah. Yeah.
These guys can have these conversations about the possibilities for her, and she then very legitimately would scoff at what these men are talking about over there.
Yeah, and she speaks very much from her body, right? She's like, "Am I going to have pleasure? Am I like, and after I no longer am, after I no longer am of the ways of women or whatever that she says." She
Right.
speaks very, very kind of very practically from a physical perspective.
Right.
And here are these men are kind of like, debating her body.
Right. Yeah, and I think the laughter too is, well, I think of laughter as something that happens as a release of tension,
Yeah.
and in many ways that she proclaims the truth, which is what you're talking about is impossible,
Mm-hmm.
and this tension that's released in that moment in the story is the collision of the promise and reality, and in some ways I think that every moment where faith meets reality in some ways is a moment for that kind of laughter. It's a laughter that's the most truthful response to faith in the real world.
I'm thinking right now about, like my daughter, like 3 days ago, she went to a demonstration, and she's talking about defunding the police, right? And I said, that's not going to happen. And then, like, literally 2 days later, the Minneapolis city council says they're gonna dissolve the police department. Like,
Yeah.
did anybody see that coming? I did not see that coming. And,
No.
and it's like, there's a way in which, um, reality closes you off to the possibilities, and you know and acting in faith that change is possible is the liberating and exciting place to be. Is it
Yeah.
is it also the place that makes us laugh? I don't know.
Well, and it's in the context of her laughter, um, is this association with this phrase, is I think the messenger's mouth, is anything too wonderful for the Lord?
Yeah.
And that hits, because I set expectations for what God can do or what can happen that are very realistic ones, and I want to be honest, very pessimistic ones.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm not nearly at a place where, like, I wouldn't even laugh. I would just be like, I wouldn't believe it. I would just be like, yeah, right.
Right.
And yet the child of this Sarah and Abraham faith couple, iconic, central, the child of the faith couple is laughter.
Yeah.
And that laughter is simultaneously the laughter that is completely, how could this happen? But it's also a laughter of, is anything too wonderful for God?
Right.
And it's a laughter of, we never saw this coming, and here it is.
Right.
And it's a laughter that changes its meaning, I think, from Annunciation to birth.
Right. Right. You have this, in a way, you have reality over here of the, and then you have miracle over here. And it's pivoting around this human expression of laughter, which is
Yeah.
is really, and the laughter, in some ways, the laughter is kind of like it as you just said, that's so amazing. The laughter is both disbelief and wonder, in a way.
Yeah. And it's in some ways, I think, the laughter is, so we have Abraham's extravagant welcome. That's the response of faith. And laughter is another response of faith, which is truthful, and it's from the body. And it says that this God continues to surprise,
Mm-hmm.
and continues to bring possibility where we had discounted any possibility, and a way where we had discounted any way forward. And this laughter then kind of echoes through the century, the millennia, as the laughter that can sustain us as we consider the present impossibilities, and the lists that perhaps we keep, the items of our despair, that we can be haunted by Sarah's laughter.
It's an amazing story, isn't it?
It is. I didn't realize it was so rich. I mean, I did, but it's rich again.
Yeah.
And I think it has a lot to say for us right now as we live in a very uncertain moment. Goodness gracious.
Yeah, and the thing is, here's the other thing which takes us perhaps full circle, which is that we talked about the confusion of the singular and the plural, and how God appears in the plural at the beginning of this story. And really, I think, before we even launched into our discussion, we said, may God bless the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. And we could never perhaps have reached the understandings that we've reached if this weren't a plural experience between the two of us, right? It's like, it's amazing. Something to laugh about.
Yeah, it's something to laugh about.
Incredible.
Yeah.
It's such a pleasure, Joel. Such a pleasure.
Yeah. I'm so glad that this idea came to you, and that we could finally make this happen.
Yeah. Would it be too much, Joel, if I were to ask you to lead us in prayer as a closing?
It would not be too much, and I would extravagantly welcome that invitation. So
Thank you.
let us pray. God, your goodness surprises us and overwhelms our troubled hearts. We are so used to things going wrong, to loss, to grief, and you break through that in surprising ways, echoing Sarah's laughter, opening us up again to the true nature of who we are as children, as sisters and brothers, as family of God, on a journey together toward beloved community. You, O God, cannot be understood or seen or encountered except as one who brings us into communion. And we thank you that once again in this story and in our hearing and sharing, that you have brought us again into your communion. and have opened our hearts again beyond the fear and distrust into that mutuality for which we are made and by which we are healed. God, we give you thanks that faith leads us forward even into that which we thought was impossible. And we thank you that in your eternal goodness, we move and live and have our being. Be with us, bless us as we take this truth, this love, and this extravagant welcome that you have given to us into the world, a world that you love and long to heal. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, Joel. This has been terrific.
Thank you, Mark.